Yes. Questions? You first and then you first and then the young lady. Yeah. Ski-Bo.
Burial ground corner, I've always been fascinated where that comes from. Please, do you have any information on that?
Well, that is a descriptive name, so there's a burial ground, but I'll tell you, other than the name, we don't have any other information. We just know that it wouldn't. These were all administered by the Anglican Church. That was a state church, so they had official recognition and support. Burial ground corner was an unofficial cemetery, probably Baptist, because the Baptist denomination in the Bahamas was always blacks only. It wasn't that it was restricted to blacks, it was brought in by free blacks, and so it stayed within the black community. So I would suspect it was Baptist, but that's been destroyed long. But those names like that are descriptive names, so there was a burial ground somewhere near there, but we have no clue.
The second part, the property or the land that we had the experimental farm on Infant Bureau,
Oh, okay.
Marcus, that land.
Yeah.
Was any part of that ever used as a graveyard?
No, that was originally a part of the Fort Charlotte complex. As far as I know, they didn't bury people out there. Because we know the officers are buried in Western Cemetery. The black ones would be in Bethlehem burial ground, wherever.
Okay. Well, this Potter's Field to the south of that, that they've closed down now, where the
Marshall View Cemetery, Marshall View Cemetery, because again, no, I was in my own car then. I had just come back from like a 2-month seminar program on historic preservation of the Caribbean, and the tractor was going through the last road nearest to the road.
Yeah.
But Infant View Cemetery, Marshall View Cemetery was opened in January 1892. It was destroyed in 1991.
Okay.
And again, ignorance is not bliss. That was true ignorance. That's,
Okay.
but Jim, let me get the young lady first, and then you.
So you said this is a grave?
That's a grave marker, a cover.
So where did you say it came from?
On East Hill Street, yeah. Next to the post office, where the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was. The first building, if you headed towards Government House, that's headed west on East Hill Street. The property right after the post office parking lot, where Ministry of Foreign Affairs was, it was from the backyard of there. Now, there is an illustration in here that shows Nassau. I think it's a bit further down. It's on the other side of this, but there is an illustration.
That long one with
The long one,
black,
yeah. That one. It shows Mr. Walker's house. That's Mr. Walker. His house was East Hill Street. His house was either that the basis of that house is his house, or his house was on that property. But that style of marker was common. That wouldn't have been upright, it would have laid flat on the ground. And that's, I think that's limestone. This one here is marble, but that's limestone. That was locally done. That's granite, okay. That was expensive, but yeah, Jim.
On a note map, I saw that there was a cemetery or burial ground on the corner of Charlotte Street and Shirley Street.
That's Christchurch Cemetery now, where Clawton House is. That was Christchurch Cemetery. That would have gone back to the 1600s. What they did, they thought they were being very helpful. They moved the headstones and put them in the yard at Christchurch. So they saved some of the headstones, but they destroyed the cemetery. I know all this because in that same historic preservation course that I was on in the early 90s, we ran into an historic cemetery preservationist in the Huguenot Cemetery, that's the non-Catholic graveyard in St. Augustine in Florida. We brought her to Nassau in the early 1990s, and we did surveys of Western Cemetery, Center Burial Ground. We surveyed the markers in Christchurch. We did St. Matthew's, and the private one is Ebenezer, because that would date to about the same time, but that is private. That's Methodist. They didn't have the government support, so that's private. But in Ebenezer Churchyard, in the front, on the Shirley Street side, you would see some of the very high tomes like these, because that was the style then. They don't always have legible markers on them, because these markers, you had to order them from the gravestone maker wherever, because some of these actually have the signature on them like an artist. And because I learned all of this going through with the historic cemetery preservationists. Like this one, I checked this one. It wouldn't be on the front, it should be on the back at the lower end. The same way an artist signs their painting. Stone carver grave, a headstone maker would sign the high-end ones would sign their work. And some of these were brought in here from Massachusetts, from New England, mostly over the US, but some of them definitely would have come from England. And it would take the family a couple years to put the order in, have it shipped here, because it would have to come in on the ship in ballast and then be erected. So sometimes you find these older tombs that never did have their written stone installed, because somehow the family never got around to it. And Nassau has the biggest, most well-established ones, but I was in Governor's Harbor a couple weeks ago. Governor's Harbor, St. Patrick's. St. Patrick's Parish was started in 1795 along with St. Matthew's. Those were the two parishes created in 1795. So the White Cemetery for St. Patrick's has some of these same kinds of markers. The Black Cemetery, the markers, that would have been cycled out, but they have the trees in there. Exuma, they don't have general public cemeteries. These would have been on private properties, on plantations. So all through the Bahamas, you would find these, usually the ones from the 1700s would be the high above ground ones like these. These are the very simple ones. These are like late 1790s, early 1800s. The earlier ones would be a bit more ornate, but they are above. The body isn't in them. The body is still in the ground, but that is to show your money and stuff. These type upright tablets, these become more common after about 1820. These are later. So once you see these, you know they're later. The one like this is 1870. That's kind of late for this style, but and this one is 1860s. If you see slate and sandstone, they can be like 1700s and 1600s. The style of the stone, the material used, those are some of the fashions in funerary architecture, as they put it. But it was fascinating to see the amount of information, not only from the style of grave, but they would give you a synopsis of the person in that they would tell you who they are. And when you get to the black cemeteries, they're not doing all of that, but the dishes they're leaving on the grave is giving you some indication of who that person was.
Two things. Do you happen to know the year of the Catholic cemetery when it was built?
Now I'll tell you, the Catholic Church, because this was a British colony, the Catholic Church was not formally established here until the 1890s. And it became established in the 1890s because I think it was Father He was shipwrecked near San Salvador, near the current San Salvador, in 1892. He thought that was God's Providence wanting him to come here. So he asked his abbey to send him back here. It was because of him that the Catholic Church was finally able to establish churches. So their cemetery won't be earlier than the 1890s. Yeah. We know that there were Catholics here, but they couldn't openly practice. They would have services and ceremonies in private homes. Because in English colonies, literally it was
Church of England.
policy not to allow Catholics to openly migrate to an English colony. Places like Trinidad that had been Spanish and had an established Catholic tradition, it was different. But a place like the Bahamas that was always English, they literally did not allow Catholics to openly practice there.
And the other thing is, you always speak of the origin of the slaves coming from West Africa, not East Africa?
Yeah, for the Bahamas, if we had any from East Africa, it was very few. I'll tell you, for the Bahamas, when the slaves were coming here and being sold here as slaves, because the slave trade, where they were getting most of the slaves, varied by time and country. So when the British were heavy in the slave trade, they were coming from the area around Ghana, between Sierra Leone and Ghana, what they would call the Gold Coast. From the very late 1700s on, when the abolitionist movement started to develop, because they realized it was a bit too far-fetched to just go straight for emancipation, so they started to chip away. The first victory for them was the abolition of the slave trade. And I mentioned the West India regiments. The West India regiments were created in the mid-1790s, and they were always created, the foot soldiers were always black. The British government had a huge debate with itself, because originally they was trying to fool themselves into thinking they could buy some slaves, or some slave owners would offer their slaves as foot soldiers. They had to ditch that idea. And they realized it would be hypocritical of the British government to be buying enslaved people. That was already not politically correct. And with that same act that abolished the slave trade, that act also established the fact that soldiers, foot soldiers of the West India Regiment were free men. They were not slaves. And that's why the British government then, rather than buying slaves, when the Royal Navy would capture a slaving ship, they would confiscate the captives. They would be, how would they term it? They were forfeited to the crown, and the crown would release its right to hold them as slaves. But that act also formally established that West India Regiment soldiers were free. And by that time, by the early 1800s, the heavy slaving area for the Portuguese and the Spanish were the big slavers then, was around the Baida Biafra, current Dahomey, Nigeria. So that's how come we got so many Yoruba and Igbo, because we were getting a lot of liberated Africans settled here. They were, between the US and Cuba, the two biggest markets for slaves this far over. Brazil was even bigger. The ones from East Africa, a lot of them would go to Brazil, and from the Congo area, they would go to Brazil. We didn't get very many East Africans, no.
Okay, we have a young student in here, so she may not understand what in situ is.
In situ?
So you could tell her.
In situ, that's Latin. I never formally did any Latin. I studied Spanish and French. But in situ means it's still in place. It's in its original positioning. So in archaeology, it's critical if you find something, you leave it in situ until you record as many details as possible, because once you move it, you can't put it back exactly. And its original positioning is going to give you some information about how it was used, why it was there, those kinds of details. So you want to pay attention to that before you move it and show off your cool new find. Because in archaeology, not only what it is, but the conditions and where you found it makes as much of a difference as well.